Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Meta. After many ages and seasons, that's exactly what we're here to talk about today.
And if it's your first time joining us on the Meta podcast, that's exactly what we talk about. Meta-analysis of everything. Video games and not video games. But you're joining us in our Zelda series. So if you didn't tune in last time, we talked about Link's Awakening. And we'll probably riff off of some stuff we talked about in that one. But it was a long time ago, so maybe not. Here we go.
Yeah, so this time we decided to go around with Oracle of Ages and Seasons, starting with Ages first.
For the Game Boy.
Game Boy Color. And there were a lot of mixed feelings coming out of this, and also going into it a little bit. On the exterior, when you look at it, it sort of just seemed kind of like a cash grab, in a sense, because a lot of the game, to get the full experience of it, you needed to both have Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. To get the New Game Plus, you can do a link cable, and so you need that as well.
It's like buy all of the Game Boy peripherals to enjoy the whole experience of these two $60, I don't know, $30 games when they came out. It's probably pretty expensive, let alone the Game Boy Color console itself. It's kind of ridiculous. And they came out in 2001, so it was late in the Game Boy Color's life, where Game Boy Color already didn't have a lot of games to play, and everybody was kind of over it.
And it would just be 1 year later that they started to come out with the Game Boy Advance and
superior console in every way.
and a lot of the successful things such as Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which sort of paved the way for its success.
Yeah, I think a lot of people skipped the Game Boy Color, especially since the Advance was backwards compatible. Because it would make sense that they'd have loyalty to their original brick Game Boy and then not actually purchase the Game Boy Color, because the only difference in hardware was maybe fine-tune the speakers and then more, 32-bit, 16-bit color graphics. Not that much of a difference. So yeah, nobody could really afford it, except they were rich bastards.
And also one of the things as well is it was definitely shadowed by a lot of the giant titles that came out of Nintendo during that time. If you think about it, Majora's Mask had come out just the previous year. Ocarina of Time came out in 98. There was more Nintendo titles such as Pokemon Gold and Silver, which is
give it a second.
Okay. And so just at the time, it just seemed like there was a lot of other things available, and it was almost just sort of like a gap filler, it felt.
Yeah, so Link's Awakening came out in 1993, a whole 8 years before Oracle of Ages and Seasons. And it felt like a more cohesive experience. And from our last podcast, we shit on it a little bit because of its kind of glitchy gameplay and spots, but we still, to this day, love Link's Awakening for its story and soundtrack. And there's the train. Oh!
Technical difficulties. We'll be right back.
And we're back.
Yeah, after that short train disruption.
Yeah, everything's fine.
So anyways, leading into it, how I remembered Oracles was a lot different than playing it now. And I think that was such a huge factor to it, because there was definitely this nostalgia sensation when I thought about it. But then playing it recently sort of left a little bit of a sour taste.
Yeah, the nostalgia blinders, where you go back and you play Sonic Adventure 2 and you think it's going to be great, and then it's Sonic Adventure 2 and you want to kill yourself. But it's with these games, and they were not as good as both of us recalled.
And I think also, considering the fact that Link's Awakening came out 8 years prior to it, and then sort of looking at what this game had offered, was very disappointing. And one of the biggest things to sort of connect that is kind of like considering the story aspect of it. And in Link's Awakening, the story was way more complex, or maybe not complex, but way more interesting, and I think it left much more of like a moral dilemma that the player sort of felt when they really wrapped their mind around what was happening. And I think that was something that was like truly impacting of the game. And considering both of these titles, it's just some long plot to revive Ganon. Spoilers, and
right, there will be spoilers
and
in every podcast we talk about ever.
And one of the biggest things that was like really disappointing about this was the fact that like to even get the Ganon ending, you had to play both games. So you had to have purchased both games, as we said, and that entire task was just so tedious and drawn out. And it sort of became this part where it seemed like the game would have been really amazing if it was just two games in one. And you had to do like one thing at like one place, like, and it just took the best elements of like what each game had to offer, and then as a result created this like really cohesive story.
Yeah. And it would have been cool to even have like some map connection like in Silver and Gold, where you beat Ages and then there's like a mid-game boss, mid-game dungeon, something that then sends you into the seasons, Holodrum and Labrinia. It'd be way cool if they were combined like in Pokemon Silver and Gold, but instead they really trying to push that password system that ultimately was not as lucrative, probably.
And it's something that also as well, like the password system I think would have been totally fine if it had that same style that Pokemon Silver and Gold had, where once you were able to access like one of the continents by like beating everything there, let's say, you could then go back.
Oh yeah, it's mutually beneficial.
Yeah,
for both. Like whether you have Silver or Gold, because when you own both games or have a friend who has the other game, then you can trade the Pokemon that aren't available in that. Or when you just have the single one, you still get the full experience of the next or previous map, but you can still fly between them easily. Well, not super easily, because you still have to... That's what it would... Like, it would be perfect if they redid this game and made it more like Pokemon Silver. That's kind of the bottom line, is if instead of the two very distinct games that had a lackluster story and kind of horrible end boss, which we'll talk about later, it could have been a really good, solid game that more people, I think, would have enjoyed and remembered.
Mm-hmm. And just like so many aspects, like if they approached it from that perspective, I think there would have been so many systems that would have just made sense. Like the password system would have made total sense, because you would have like bumped into some Zora on like Labrinia or wherever they're at, and they'd be like, oh hey, here's this code, and like maybe as a player you're like, huh, like what do I do with this code? And then later on you go to this other continent and you're like, oh wait, like here's all these like these codes I have, and then you're like, oh there's codes here too, well I can just backtrack real quick and grab the cool item over there.
Yeah, and they could have simplified the system, because with the codes it was like per game, each code 16 digits, including club signs, like the fucking
like
cards. So it's like if the game was a single piece, they could have made it like you have spoken to this person and completed their criteria, do like a fetch quest, and then end up in the next world, and then boom, do a thing for them. It just would have worked way better than the system that we encountered in Seasons. Oh man, flashbacks.
But one of the biggest things too, I think, is also sort of there was this lack of cohesion that felt between both games. Like you'd go in to play Ages, and you had two settings. You had present and you had past. And when you went to if it wasn't obvious what to do in the present, you just went to the past and like you could advance the plot, like so on and so forth. And just sort of like the whole entire aspect of Seasons, where it's like you had 4 seasons to choose from. Like it might not always necessarily like, it wasn't very convoluted in terms of like you're like, oh, I don't know where to go, like I just changed the season. But there was a lot of tracking that had to happen, where it's like, oh wait, like okay, like there's mushrooms that do a thing when it's fall.
Yeah.
There's like
It snows in winter.
it like
trees die and
vines grow in summer and
flowers bloom in spring. It all makes sense from like a common sense standpoint, but in the game it kind of failed to be like an engaging game mechanic. Like ultimately, it was kind of one note where you, by the end of the game, you're like, oh, just stand on this stump 4 times and wave your rod around and have a dance party and then progress the game. But in the beginning, I think it was because you don't start out with all the seasons. That was a good, both like storytelling mechanic and like game mechanic, because you're going through these areas and you're having trouble like reaching all of the places in them because you don't have all the seasons. And so in the game, then you get all the 4 seasons and you're like, oh, I'm going to go back to this cool place in the map and turn it to fall and pick up these mushrooms and go on a trip.
and get a ring appraised.
Yeah.
And that's just like, oh man, the entire ring system too was something that it kind of is very upsetting, because after like 8 years, when you consider like there was the whole entire like equip system for items in Link's Awakening, and you had that exact same system 8 years later, and then it's like, oh, but there's this new kind of like equip feature with rings, and it was the most frustrating, tedious process to go through, because it's like you collect a bunch of rings that you needed to get appraised, and so you'd go to get them appraised, and like you had to do them one at a time, and you couldn't do them all at once. And then it's like, oh well, here's this like ring box, so like you have these rings appraised, but you can't just equip any one you want.
The ring menu to equip them was atrocious.
It was absolutely terrible.
Did not work. It did not work going to Vasu and getting a ring, and then it did not work that it doesn't automatically equip a ring, because like when I was a kid, I didn't know. I would put the ring in my box and it'd be in my inventory, and I was like, sweet, I'm not taking damage from small rocks. And then I'd still take damage from small rocks. I'd be like, this ring doesn't work, but the whole time it's not equipped. And it's like, of course I learned that now. Or I mean, I probably did the second time I played it, but the fact that it's not very well, like... Oh, he does say rings do nothing unless worn, but then he doesn't tell you how to equip a ring still. Mm-hmm. Unless you talk to the snakes, maybe.
Snakes.
Or the books on the side.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of things lacking from...
You know, maybe equip multiple rings instead of just one ring, then it'd be like, oh...
10 fingers.
Yeah. And then just pimping out with all my ring fingers.
Just Link with that.
But it was just like...
I rule. I rule.
But just like so much of it could have been improved. And I think that sort of explained some of the aspects of the game. Or it didn't explain it, but it more so
It was very telling.
Of the game's design.
Yeah. Like in that one mechanic, they're like... You can look at that, you can look at rings and be like, oh no. Oh no. More mechanics. I don't know, everything besides new items were already in Awakening.
Mm-hmm. And there was some new items that was really sweet, and I feel like was a really good twist on how the game played. Like, I think the magnetic gloves were absolutely sweet, besides the sound effect it played that was absolutely...
That looks great on the couch.
And like,
Sorry.
yeah, some of them were just like, I don't know, really awesome and amazing, and other ones were like, all right, cool, I guess I'll use it.
Yeah, Rock's cape was amazing. Like, these were like pushing the limits of like sprite-based, like... The way Link moves with the gloves, when it's not glitchy and you're over a pit on the revolving things, dying every second, like I was, like zipping across a screen just because you're like polarized the opposite way, was really satisfying, and it worked well when it did work. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of other... Oh, the L2 gloves in Ages? Or was it Seasons? Either way, where you could pick up, kind of like in Ocarina of Time, you could pick up larger objects.
Yeah.
And it's like, that was crazy, because the objects in the game were already like 2 squares high, you know? And you pick him up, and it feels like he's like picking up the like sarcophagus or whatever, and that feels good. And that made the game like that's when you look past some of the issues of the game and you actually have fun with it. But there's still other glaring issues ultimately that soured the experience for us.
Yeah, and I think other big parts of that as well were like some of the things that one of the biggest things I do like in a Zelda game is I figure out what my sword can break, and for me in like 2D Zeldas it's always pots. I'm like, can my sword break pots? And the fact that you needed like the level 2 sword to be able to break pots is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
Because it's just one of those small details where you're like, I just wish I could just break this pot with my... I have to like equip the glove now and pick it up and then throw it or whatever. And that also like pointed out some of the other things too, was there are items you would get that you'd have to equip to use where it would have made way more sense to have it as sort of just this passive ability. Like the power bracelet, the ability to like lift up pots and rocks, like would have made way more sense as just a passive item.
Yeah. Because, I mean, they did that in Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask. All the 3D Zeldas have that. Probably in some of the later ones. I can't remember in the DS ones if you even get power bracelets. But, yeah, it's like passive abilities. Because the problem with having to equip every single item is that in boss fights, when you're having to use 2 or 3 different items to beat them, you're constantly pausing the game, and it breaks you out of the immersion, it breaks you out of the timing, and it ruins it for you, because you're like, sweet, I'm having an adventure. Oh wait, pause time, pull out a
seed shooter
or a slingshot and ruin my life.
And that was also just like some of the other parts of the game that were very infuriating was the boss fights and the mini boss fights, because there were just some boss fights that's like, all right, dodge the one mechanic or move and then just like swing your sword like mad until it dies, and
Dragons.
It's like
Unicorns.
and that's like okay when it's the first or second boss, but then you get to like the 7th boss and you're doing the same thing. Like he shoots a beam across the floor, jump over it, hit him with your sword. And then it's like, that's still, I don't know, it didn't feel very innovative in terms of like boss fights. And then you'd have like some mini boss fights that were just insane. Where
Sabretooth.
The Sabretooth
Sonic over here, fucking rolling all around. Impossible to dodge because of its weird, like, round pattern. And it's so fast. And it had like a
huge
hitbox. It was almost impossible. Was I dying? I was dying I died like 4 times on that just because I was like, this is impossible.
And then there was the one where like you go to
the bat?
The bat sucked too. And then there was also the like fire and ice guy as well, where you had to like, you talked to like the owl beforehand and he's like something ice, like,
oh yeah,
nice.
with the vague hint on how to beat it, and then was it he had to hit himself with his own projectile?
He would use ice on you. Like you had to turn him into the ice mode, and then you had to do something with the ice, like hit it with a seed or something like that, so it changed properties.
And then pick it up.
Yeah, and then throw it at him. And like that entire cycle of
it was
doing
like
that,
between like 3 different items too, because you had to do, for you, and if I had been doing it, it was like Quicksilver Seeds, because you don't want to get hit by him, and then it was like Slingshot maybe to like change the thing, so that's already a switch, and then like Rock's Feather for dodging once you've done the Quicksilver, and then Power Bracelet, and it's like, that's too much. That's way too many mechanics in one fight, opposed to just hitting him with your sword.
Yeah.
So it's like, was it too? There was no middle ground for anything they were doing. They were like, super complex, impossible. This dungeon takes an hour to half an hour, and it shouldn't. To this dungeon takes 20 minutes, and the boss fight is just hitting his dick with a sword.
And it's like, maybe, I think, like, the game could have, like, been vastly improved if there was just, like, a single button for, like, sword, which is, like, let's just say B in this case, and then, like, A was your item, and then you could, like, use L and R to swap between, like, items.
But there weren't L and R on the Game Boy Color.
Oh, that's a good point.
That was on the Advance.
That's right.
So it's like, should they have waited
completely? I am thinking a generation ahead, and maybe that's what it did get down to. Is like maybe we just needed to wait it out.
What were the triggers used for in Minish Cap? Rolling?
I don't remember.
I don't
played
know.
Minish
I
Cap
hated
like
Minish
once.
Cap.
Yeah, it was terrible. I remember it being bad.
Was that on the? That was on the Advance. It had the DS style graphics though, kind of.
Yeah.
Just a little bit less. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, you're thinking of triggers. Didn't even have that. They used the buttons as they could have.
Or they could have, like, I don't know, you could have used, like, select, maybe?
Because but that was the menu.
No,
or the
because you... Oh, okay.
I'm telling you, man. They had all the buttons to full capacity. It was just there weren't... I mean, if you added more buttons on a Game Boy, it wouldn't make it better.
Yeah.
The triggers are, of course, the perfect medium between that, which is why the Game Boy Advance worked.
And maybe that's just like, maybe that's what it was with this game. Maybe it was a game either too ambitious for its time or just came out too early and needed to be later. And I think they could have done the improvements as far as like, maybe we can just make this like one big map where you can like jump to and from continents. Like once you hit a certain point in the game, like maybe once you've beaten like one continent entirely, there's no repercussions to going back there with new items because you've already like you already have the potential to explore it fully and not gimmick anything with like items from the different continent.
And the thing that would make that work is the tornado seeds. Like that would make that work. That's already in both games. And there's so many items that cross over between both games that it would not be super challenging. And we know that it comes down to the selling point is Nintendo being like, let's sell 2 games instead of 1, and then that's what they did, and we know that.
Because Nintendo's just Vasu, apparently.
Here's your games, and my snakes will deliver them. No, it's like we know that, but for the future, if they do like a remake, which they are possibly releasing it on the eStore soon, or if this, I don't know, whenever you're listening to this, it's like they could take into account the correct decisions they've made in other game series and apply them to this duo of games, and it would benefit exponentially.
And maybe they could do it in the same approach that they did with A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds, where it wasn't necessarily a remake of the game, but it was this reboot that happened.
It was like a retelling. It was
a totally different storyline, but it mimicked a lot of things similar, and
felt similar.
Yeah, and felt similar, and I think that could be like a very well received.
I think that would be a smart move
and a very redeeming product
for these games. Yeah.
And I want to jump back to sort of the infuriating boss fights, either between its like complete simplicity or its sheer impossibleness. And I think we just need to really jump into like the biggest fucking gaping hole of design.
We're talking about the Twinrova fight?
We're talking about the Twinrova fight.
Oh no. Not the Twinrova fight.
This was like...
It gives me a headache just thinking about it.
It is.
Just watching you and then myself doing it.
Possibly the worst designed.
It was like
fight.
20 to 25 times.
And it just felt like one of those fights where like they got to like the end and they're like, all right, well, this game's shipping out 2 weeks from now. We got to make this fight, and it has to be kind of hard because it's like the almost
end all be all.
Yeah, right. Okay, let's take all these mechanics. It's just really frustrating, and there we go. And it was literally the worst.
It didn't work in 2D
thing.
space. The only way we were able to beat it was to stand in a corner like a little bitch and swing your sword whenever they hit a projectile and hope that they didn't go into the corner and hurt you, and that the projectile bounced into them. And
The right them.
Yeah, not there were two, so you had to hit ice into fire or fire into ice. And then after that phase, the bullshit ice floor and lava floor phase, which was even harder and more convoluted than the 2D ping pong battle.
Plus, like, what was like even like terrible about it was that kind of game where at no point in the game had you encountered something similar in terms of it. Like, you had similar ideas and mechanics, like, oh, you
like
kill,
bullet hell,
or like, you know,
avoid or hit.
Avoid hit, yeah, or like, you know, fire hurts ice, vice versa kind of thing, right? But you never encountered, like,
to this degree.
In Ocarina of Time, when you fight Ganondorf at the very end, you know, after you like volley with him a bunch with like when he's throwing like light balls at you, yeah, like, you know, then that you like hit him with an arrow and then like you go up and swing your sword at him, kind of thing, right? And like you only knew to do that though because in the Forest Temple you fought Phantom Ganon, yeah, and
just without the light arrows.
Yeah, and so that was like the whole entire thing was you're like, oh, okay, I've done this before, I know how to do it.
But they never.
Ever.
There was Twinrova is not in the game, except in story cutscenes until the very end of the New Game Plus, which might only be in seasons, but don't take my word for that, because we just did it in that order. So if you do, I don't know who would want to play this game after like listening to us shit on it for half an hour.
But it's like that kind of thing where like, yeah, you never encountered Twinrova at any point earlier in the game in terms of like a fight mechanic. So like, it's like, okay, well, cool, we have ice and fire, and the problem with it was, like, you would hit her in, like, one phase or whatever, and it would seem like she was taking damage, and then she would, like, switch over to, like, her next thing, and then there's this tiny little detail that you never knew about where you had to take out your seed shooter and shoot her while she's, like, in this, like, looks like a kind of, like, she took damage state that lasts for, like, a couple frames. And you're just like, well, I never knew about that. So here I was, like, the first few attempts doing it and being like,
not doing any damage and just losing health.
And just, but like thinking that I was doing damage.
Right.
And so.
Because it does make it like flashes or something. Like it does have feedback.
Like a hit indicator.
Yeah. But it's not a damage indicator, which is a huge, glaring issue.
Yeah. So it's just like if you just didn't have that knowledge, like you were just.
Yeah.
You would be like.
And they could have put the first half of the Twinrova fight in a different capacity, like way early in the game. Because it's not difficult. And then they would, you know, like run away. And it would have been like, you'll do this, we'll get you again, kitty. And then like it's shorter in the end. But it's like, it would have been the like introduction to that happening. But yeah, I think ultimately the second phase is what completely sours that fight, because there's no lead up to it, and it's just, instead of it making sense like in Ocarina of Time with the mirror shield, it's awful.
Yeah, and there's nothing there to give you like fight info on it. You just kind of go into it and you're like, I guess you know, like you have like, because if people played Ocarina of Time, they're like, oh, okay, the fire and ice deal, right? Like it's same idea for the fight. But then you get to the second phase, and you're like, do I just do the same thing? No, you don't. You seed shoot it, and like, what a terrible item.
Oh yeah. It was slingshot.
I hate the seed shooter. Or a slingshot. I hate the slingshot too in that game.
You do hate the slingshot.
I do hate it.
It's almost worse than the seed shooter.
I'd rather just have a bow, an arrow.
Like in Awakening.
Whoa.
Novel idea. All right. I talked about the Twinrova fight. And, mechanics, good, bad. It's a thing. Did we talk about linked games?
We talked about, like, we mentioned earlier about
you
how,
did.
Yeah, but how it's just kind of like this sort of, like, it felt really cash grabby mechanic where it's like, you can link your game. And you're like, all right, let me go buy a link cable, Mom.
Let me go buy
$20
another Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color.
Yeah, and so ultimately, I feel in Oracle of Ages and Seasons, you have to if you're not playing the game in a very monotonous, just like blank mind set, you have to really parse through what you're doing to find the good in it.
Yeah.
And
the only reason we were able to beat it, because I think we still beat it pretty quickly, it's because I have all that shit stored in my head from the 3 to 4 times I've already played the game. And it's like a newcomer to that game would immediately look up a walkthrough in the Mermaid Dungeon, in multiple parts of Seasons and stuff. It's like a lot of stuff. Oh my god, the parts in Seasons where you have to find the 4 the PlayStation controller buttons.
Oh yeah.
It's like that is not very well. I mean, the triangle piece is guarded by the bat, and he's like, "You'll never find all these to get into the temple or whatever." And it's like that's the one time that you're told like this opens the temple door, and you're like, "Oh, okay." And then from there on, the rest are just in. Wasn't one under the lake?
Yeah, we found it like by mistake, I think.
Yeah, it's just because I was like, oh, there's a hole there, and then I like went to it, and then it was there. It's like all that stuff. It feels very old game though, you know.
Yeah.
Where like Ocarina of Time doesn't really tell you much.
And
so I
I
mean
think,
that's kind of okay.
Well, I think I could have forgive that if the game came out in 1993.
It came out in 2001.
Yeah, it came out in 2001 after there was already so much exploration into like, you know, between PlayStation and its like game development and like the game development cycle that Nintendo had gone through with like its successful titles of the time.
Plus, the phone system for hints in Link's Awakening was much more useful than like going to see Impa, you know, for progression. Because we never had to do that because we knew what we were doing. But like new players, would they know to return to Impa's house and be like, what do I do next? And then she's like, make sure to talk to Gorons and don't feed the lizard or like the phone system made a lot of sense in Link's Awakening because it's like an RPG, so you get lost, but you got the little hint system everywhere. I don't know. That worked.
Yeah. I think probably one of the most redeeming parts of Oracles was in Ages, where we lost our shield to the what are they called?
The Tokies?
The Tokies, yeah, and like the jack all your shit in the beginning when you end up on their island, and we're like, oh, okay, that one has our shield. And
they're so
like,
kind.
He runs away, yeah, and we're like, at the end, we're like, okay, we got all our stuff back to continue on. We're like, wait, we have to buy another shield? What the fuck? What kind of game design is this? And like, it just sucked. And it was like the best thing was like when we played it again later on, like, and we're way farther in the game, we like found
3 dungeons later.
Yeah, we find like this little back entrance to the island that like was only accessible once you had like the mermaid suit or whatever,
yep.
Which also sucked because you couldn't use like your B item.
You can only use A.
Yeah, like you could only use like A and not the B.
B was swim.
And you like. We got in that cave, and there's that dude, that one Toki. We're like, oh, what's up with you? He's like, yeah, there's this shield here, but I don't know whose it is, but I just been polishing it. You want it? And we're like, wait, oh, shit, that's our shield. And then we got the L2 shield. And I thought,
on a whim.
On a whim. And I thought that was pretty cool. Like, I thought that was really creative on their part, but like I said, that's one of the few things to parse out to be like, that was really cool and creative. But a lot of it just kind of felt like very gimmicky and very monotonous and tedious. And that's why it just leaves this terrible taste in my mouth when I think about it now.
Yeah. There's like the few parts that were really fun and like well fleshed out in the kind of pile of stuff that didn't work that they kept trying in both games. Because you're like, oh, cool. I kind of, like, we played Ages, but then a lot of the stuff in Seasons was, like, the same. It still had the trading sequence. I mean, of course, that's, like, a staple of Zelda games, but it's, like, it was the same, because you get the same item out of it.
Yeah.
Right? You got the L2 sword at the end of...
Yep.
In Ages?
Wait. Yep.
Yeah. But we were able to cheat by just knowing.
Oh, yeah. That was also another oversight, man. Like, the fact that you could get the L2 sword without doing the trading sequence, and it just, like, voided the entire trading sequence.
Yeah.
Because it's, like, the only reason you did the trading sequence was to find out the the secret to getting the L2 sword, which if you knew the secret, you could just get the L2 sword.
Yeah, they didn't have and you could do that in a remake. You could have a check of whether you have the item in your inventory and have spoken to the Octorok. Yeah, who tells you the sequence. So it's like, that would be another thing you could fix. If it was re-released, you'd be like, oh, just put in this, like, single identifier as, like, they have the music player from the windmill guy.
Yeah, whatever the final item was.
They have that, and they've spoken to the guy who lets you know, instead of just, oh, we have a scary doll, let's get the L2 sword, yeah! Yeah.
But all in all, I would say the game's kind of this sort of like tragic comedy almost. Like it's funny how many like things it draws upon, and maybe like I said, it was trying to be too ambitious, or maybe it had bigger plans for it, and it just kind of got pushed onto the back burner.
Yeah, we'll never know.
With like a lot of like Nintendo's hits that were coming out at the time, they didn't really have the like resources to it. But then it just kind of seemed like this very quickly thrown together, slapped up, made to get it like ride off on the high of like.
We should email the people who made this game
and find out and be like
do a documentary.
What were you thinking? But all in all, the game didn't seem to have like a ton of replayability. Like to get everything in it, you would need to like play Ages, then play Seasons, and then play Ages again, and then play Seasons again to get like the maximum amount of like the items and everything.
You'd play Ages, you'd play the Seasons Plus that we played.
Yeah.
While doing Ages Plus and getting the passwords from that between each game and giving them to Pharaoh in the Dekmaku Saku Chaku tree. It was just too much. It was too much playing of the same game without being different enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as a result, it just seemed to like just be more of a chore to play these games than it did to be a fun experience.
Yeah, that's the ultimate takeaway. Is it was either too quickly assembled together like a mishmash and just ended up not panning out to be what they wanted, envisioned, or they spent a really long time on it but didn't think to look back on Awakening and previous titles and learn from those mistakes and make a better game. I mean, of course the controls and stuff were a lot tighter, but the like story and everything else fell flat in the end.
There was, I think, a good way to sum it up was there wasn't any moment in Ages or Seasons that I can think of that I was like, that was a truly nostalgic moment where I like have like these really positive feelings or like this profound impact on me. Like when you first walk up to the egg on Tall Tall Mountain in Awakening.
The owl shows up.
Yeah, and like it's this huge egg, and you're like, whoa! And all the like the music is super memorable. Like there just wasn't any of that in the Oracle games.
They tried. There was the tower in Ages that they tried to make this really cool thing that fell flat. Because remember, they showed the cutscene multiple times. They're like, look, the tower's being built. Look how cool it is. And then they'd be like...
Dun, 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 dun.
And then you come back later in the game, and then they're like, oh, the tower's done. Look how cool it is. But you're like, it's not cool.
As you go in there, and then there's still like
it's not like a physical thing. Yeah.
There's
still a guy in a hard hat like... tower's done.
Why are all these snakes here?
I got paid $15 an hour.
Whoever made these games too really hated snakes.
They gave them doofy little smiles, and they made them the weakest and most annoying enemy in the game.
And they were present in every
dungeon.
And
if not every room in it.
Yeah, this seems like really just like Indiana Jones just made this game.
He's like, you know what? I hate snakes. And then he plays it, and he's like, "Why's it gotta be snakes?" he screwed himself over, really, because he put the snakes in there.
I go right playtesting, and he's like, "Oh,
Japanese Indiana Jones, oh snakes." Also, Metal Gear Solid came out on the Game Boy.
Yeah, apparently.
Unrelated. All right.
Well, I
Having
think
closing
altogether,
thoughts?
yeah, closing thoughts. I'd give this game as a combo pack.
You're gonna rate it seriously?
I would. Well, here's the thing. I wouldn't rate it, but I think I would if I only played one of the games, like Oracle of Seasons or Oracle of Ages. I think I would rate them as individual games higher than
Then
rating
the cohesive experience.
Yeah, than the cohesive experience
Linked
as
experience.
both of them.
That makes sense. I would agree. I'm not gonna rate them, but I would agree that by themselves they're much better. I think just the ending, the linked ending, completely ruined Seasons for me. Like, I think if we just played Seasons and I did the shitty, dragon boss and then it was over, I think we would have been okay.
But we didn't.
But we didn't. We had to
do
game.
Yeah, and so, that's pretty much my closing thoughts, is individually, these games are better than their collective parts together.
Yeah. So that wraps up our thoughts and analysis of the Oracle's games. Our next episode is to be determined. We might do something. We're still in the Zelda series, though, so look forward to more analysis of Zelda games. Mm-hmm. We haven't decided which one to do next, but
yeah. And if you have any thoughts or opinions on what you'd like to see in the show as well, let us know.
Yeah.
We might not have it immediately on our plate to do, but it gives us some really good insight into what to look into on Further Horizons.
Yeah, hit us up on Twitter. What are we? Shit. Let me find it. I don't know. You'll have the link somewhere. Meta the podcast. There we go. Follow us, tweet at us. I will respond. I promise. We enjoy feedback, so yeah, let us know.
Yeah.
This
All right.
has been Meta. You've been Meta.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.